Hello and what's up, my friends? It's Thunder Bob here, and tonight we're going to be talking about something a little out of the ordinary. We're going to talk about reading. I'm really passionate about books and reading. I've always enjoyed it, and I wanted to just share something I'm passionate about outside of the gaming industry. I've always been a big reader, and I'd finish probably 10 to 20 books a year in an average year. But I found lately that I've had more time to read and listen to audiobooks. I've been traveling more. I've had some more downtime at work where I can focus on reading and listening to audiobooks. And I decided to challenge myself to try to finish one book per week. And I did it. We're like 48 weeks into the year, and I'm done with my challenge. I've still got a couple more books I'll probably read, but I wanted to kind of just share what I've read this year. As part of my challenge was actually to do a short review for every book because I've had some memory issues. I feel like when I read a lot, I don't absorb, I don't remember as much. But by writing down my thoughts and giving it a score, I retain a lot more. So that's where I'm at. I've read these 52 books. We're going to do a quick review on each of them. And I will mention that many of these books are available for free if you're an Audible Plus member. There's also a free trial going on right now if you're interested. I'll mention I get a kickback on that, but if you're interested, I'll put a link down below. It's a great service I've used for many, many years, and I read a bunch of free books every year through the Audible Plus catalog. So yeah, this is everything I read this year. You'll notice a pattern in my reading. It's mostly sci-fi, speculative fiction, horror, maybe some historical fiction, fantasy. Science fiction, though, is by far my favorite genre. I love when an author uses some imaginative future society to comment on our own world, or when they create some impossible alien world to tell a story that just could never exist in our reality. I've been, a huge reader all the way back through like middle school, and the big sci-fi classic authors, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, Frank Herbert, Kurt Vonnegut. I've enjoyed them. They've really impacted my life, impacted my worldview, and my love of reading. You probably started with my father. I lost both my parents about 5 years ago. I've talked about it a few times on the channel. But in my teen years, my dad and I would take trips, these long drives to his work, and we'd have these conversations that would just go on and on. And a lot of it I remember was him describing like an old sci-fi novel that he read as a kid. And invariably, I would seek it out at my library and read it for myself and devour it. And also credit one other person. I have an uncle who passed 2 years ago now, and he gave me a copy of Timequake by Kurt Vonnegut, who is today I'd say he's probably my favorite author overall. And it really opened up a new genre and a great author. And I just want to remember my uncle and my dad who really gave me a love for reading. So here I am today. I've got an 8-year-old daughter of my own. I'm trying to pass along that gift of reading from my father and uncle along to my daughter. You know, pass something that meant a lot to me onto her. And maybe, someday you'll be doing the same thing to a child of your own. So without further ado, we're going to jump in and do a quick review of every book that I've read this year. All right, we're going to jump right into this, and I'll say up front, I'm going to try to keep these reviews pretty short, about a minute or so each, so this video is not too long. And we're going to jump to start with the first book I read this year was Altered Carbon. That's the first book in the Takeshi Kovacs series. Um, Basically, it's a sci-fi novel. It takes place in the far future where technology has been developed to allow everyone to swap bodies through the use of a cortical stack that's installed in everyone's neck. It allows the very rich to essentially live forever, but it also means the value of life changes dramatically. Takeshi Kovacs is the main character. He's awakened after a long sleep for crimes he committed, and he's given the task to find the man who murdered one of those affluent rich people who have lived for thousands of years. And I really enjoyed this first book, having read it after watching the okay Netflix adaptation. It's a noir detective story that has some really interesting ideas about life, consciousness, what would happen if society had the option to live for multiple lifetimes. And the book has, some incredible amounts of violence and some laughably detailed sex scenes. So it's not for the faint of heart by any means. It's definitely my favorite book in the series, but it doesn't quite reach kind of a classic sci-fi level for me. But it's a fun, quick read, and if you're looking for a newer sci-fi novel, I could definitely recommend this book. And the second book I read this year was Broken Angels, which is the second book in that same series. And it kind of shrugs off the noir detective vibes from the first book and is more of a war story. The story takes place on a planet in the middle of a civil war that Kovacs has been involved in for unclear reasons. And the story mostly ignores that war plot as the main character attempts to capture some alien technology, forcing him to recruit a team and avoid the ongoing conflict. Like the first, it's full of over the top violence and sex, so be prepared. I enjoyed the book, but I thought it felt a bit short of the first story, and it feels like it takes a lot of time to get moving with a kind of disappointing ending. I still liked this. I gave it a 4, like I gave the first um the Altered Carbon, but it just doesn't quite meet the quality of that first story. And that leads us to the final book in the Takeshi Kovacs series, Woken Furies. I finished this, and it's my least favorite in the series by far. It's overly complex and told in a long and meandering fashion. It introduces a few new characters that I liked, but also like a dozen that just really were unnecessary and didn't add anything. And introduced some characters from Kovacs' past that the author seems to want you to care about, but doesn't really give you much reason to care about them. They're introduced really late in the narrative. The narrative is focused on Kovacs on the run from like this odd religious order that has been murdering without real explanation. Until the back half of the novel, it kind of all becomes clear. The most interesting aspect of the book is that a younger version of Kovacs is awakened and put in a new body and is forced to try to hunt, the main character Kovacs. And it's kind of an interesting dynamic where he's hunting himself, but it's really underutilized and they only meet a couple of times in the series. And it continues with the really high violence and the sex, but the story just isn't there. I nearly put the novel down. I trudged through hoping for a good resolution, and it really doesn't have a great ending. There's some kind of hope for maybe a future for the character, but no real final resolution. And I gave this one a 3 overall. I think it's the weakest story in the series. Still not a bad story, but just doesn't compare to the first one. And the next story that I read was Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. This is just a true sci-fi classic from one of the masters of the genre. An ancient ship is identified entering our solar system, and humanity must use a small window available to investigate it before it departs. The ship and world inside are so mysterious, and even as some small revelations are made, it just adds more questions, which never really get answered until later books in the series. Overall, I really, really enjoy this story. This is actually one of the first novels that my father ever gave to me, and it means a lot to me. And I give this one a 5 star. This is just almost a perfect science fiction novel. And the next book and series I read was The Forever War and the Forever series. And this book really felt like a response to Heinlein's Starship Troopers, where that book really played up the importance of military service and kind of glorified war. This book takes the opposite approach and has a much less positive attitude towards military and really hammers in kind of the needlessness and boredom of war that only a Vietnam vet survivor could have written. It uses the concept of time dilation to play with the way society changes as the main character returns to Earth hundreds of years after, in the way kind of Vietnam vets would have returned back to their homes after Vietnam, and just seeing how far society has changed. It's a fast read and it's a really intriguing premise, but it's really rewarding. I did like this one quite a lot and gave it 4 stars. And next up was Forever Free, the second book in the Forever series, which picks up right after the end of the first one and kind of tells what happens to the remaining humans, after the hundreds of years of time dilation that the main character went through. I don't want to spoil anything, but uh, it's not great. The first half of the book is kind of this slow burn that tells kind of an interesting story about this group of humans living in a very changed society. And then at the very back half, there's a literal Deus Ex Machina that shows up, and it feels like an episode of the Twilight Zone. Uh, it actually made the first novel worse by reading this. in my opinion, and it can be completely skipped. I have a 3 star here, but I would probably put this down to 2 star in hindsight. It is a very bad follow up to the Forever War. And that leads us to the third book in the Forever series, Forever Peace. And while this has no narrative connective tissue with the previous stories, it's more similar themes that make it part of the same book series. It has similar anti war themes to the previous novels and deals with a military force that uses drone armor suits and the psychological impact that waging war from behind a screen can have on the individual. The second half of the novel, is pretty slow with a lot of setup that mostly gets resolved through another Deus Ex Machina, but at this time, it feels a lot more earned than in the second novel. So I did like this one more. I gave Forever Peace a 4, and could definitely recommend this one, though you could probably skip the second one. And next up, I read Play Nice: The Rise, Fall, and Future of Blizzard Entertainment. I'm a big time fan of Blizzard. I started playing PC games with StarCraft, Warcraft 2, Diablo, and I thought I knew everything about this developer. But there is so much in this book, so many interesting personal stories and histories. The book is primarily made up of sections detailing a particular employee's time with the company, deep dives into the background of particular games, lots of fun stories about the early start of the company, and some depressing details about the darker times. It's a fast and breezy read if you have any interest in the gaming industry or Blizzard, if you grew up on these games. Definitely a good one to check out. I gave this 4 stars. And next up is Look at the Birdie. It's a collection of unpublished short fiction by Kurt Vonnegut, and I now understand why it was unpublished. Kurt Vonnegut is by far my favorite individual novelist. He's got some of the best stories of all time, and we'll talk about some more of those later. And I've read nearly everything from him, so it was really cool to find this unpublished short fiction collection. But overall, these are mostly fails. There's 1 or 2 stories I liked. A lot of them felt like early drafts. They're missing that punchy ending, the satirical kind of voice that Vonnegut always brought with him. There's a couple of winners here, but overall, it's just not a great read. He's got other short fiction collections I would start with. But yeah, if you're looking for something if you've read everything of his, well, here's a collection of unpublished short fiction. Gave this a 3. It's not terrible. There's a couple of good ones in there, but overall, it's skippable. Next up, I read The Postman, which is also a movie. There's a decent adaptation of this from the 90s. I didn't really know what to go in, when I read this. The book's okay, but I really ended up enjoying this. This is a fix-up novel that puts a couple of short stories together, and I think the first 2 sections are actually a bit stronger than the final section, the newer section that was added. And it tells a post apocalyptic story that's actually hopeful, unlike most stories in this genre. That's not to say there's not bad times and terrible people, but the main characters and the overall feeling of the novel is for hope of the future. If you're looking for a post apocalyptic novel, I really, really dug this. I'm surprised how good it was, and I gave this 5 stars. Next up, I listened to Ender's Game, the full cast audio play on Audible. This was free through their Plus catalog. It's enjoyable, told with a full cast like a radio play. It is cut though, so there is some things lost in translation to this audio cast. So like there's no narrator. So all the story is told either through dialogue or through action. And it feels a little inorganic at times. The story is still fascinating. I do love Ender's Game quite a lot. This maybe isn't the best way. I'm kind of reviewing the audio play here, so the voice acting's really well, the way it brings a bunch of characters together. But if you want the full story, I would read the novel. But I still gave this audio play 4 stars. Next up is On the Beach. This is another post-apocalyptic novel, and I finished the Postman just before reading On the Beach, and they're 2 very different novels. On the Beach feels like the antithesis to the Postman. What do you do when there is no hope and the end is slowly reaching your shore? What do you do with the time you have left before the end? Essentially, there are no heroes in this book. There's no third act miracles, no breakthrough to save the world. From the very beginning, you know how the story is going to end. And it's possibly the bleakest book I've ever read. I had to stop multiple times as the sadness was just too great to continue. The characters mostly go about their lives ignoring this coming apocalypse, attempting to wrest as much life out of the time remaining. It's very dry, but what little action there is punchy. Um, this is a nearly 70-year-old book, so the science is a little outdated, but it's a really emotional book. I cried at the ending, to be honest. It's a sad book, but it really impacted me. I gave this 5 stars. I really enjoyed On the Beach. I'm a big Frank Herbert fan. I've read the Dune series probably 5 times, and I decided to read some other books from him. I've actually read this at least once before. This is probably his second, maybe third most famous series, the Dosadi Experiment. And this is about a subjugated people on a poison planet bred to be the most hardened warriors. They're eventually unleashed on an unprepared universe by an outsider sent to investigate. It's basically Dune with aliens, and that's not really a bad thing. It covers a lot of the same ground as Dune, but it also adds a ton of other interesting things, alien species with unique beliefs and philosophies, the Bureau of Sabotage, whose job it is to slow down the machinations of an uncaring government. Overall, I prefer the Dune series and would just suggest starting there if you're new to Frank Herbert, but this is still a good novel, and I gave it 4 stars. And I read The Hobbit. And this is the first time I've read this since middle school, about 20 years ago. And reading it today, it still feels just as magical. It's a bit less serious than The Lord of the Rings, but it's more fun with better pacing and overall much more fanciful tone. I actually listened to the Andy Serkis audiobook, and he does just a masterful reading with a unique voice for every character and absolutely nails the many songs in the book. This is an absolute classic in the fantasy genre and worth a read even as it approaches 100 years. Cormac McCarthy's quite the writer, isn't he? No Country for Old Men. I've read a bunch of Cormac McCarthy, but I had not read No Country for Old Men before. I've seen the movie, of course, good movie. This is probably the most straightforward and accessible Cormac McCarthy novel, as it started as a screenplay that was turned back into a novel, then turned back into a screenplay by the Coen brothers. If you've watched the movie, it's very, very close. Some scenes nearly word for word, and a few scenes are left out of the movie, like the hitchhiker, that makes it worth reading. And I felt the sheriff's story was a bit disconnected from the overall narrative, and the last section felt a bit overdrawn with the amount of time devoted to the sheriff harping on how our society had fallen. Overall, I enjoyed it. And a few scenes in particular, mostly the ones with just two characters talking about life, were pretty profound. I gave this 4 stars. And next up, I read Jurassic Park. I was a bit disappointed in this. I've been a big fan of the movie for ages, and when I read a book or a movie and they've been made into each other, I try to view them as separately in my mind as possible. But in this case, I just can't help but feel that the book is inferior. Perhaps it's because I grew up with the movie, but there's just so many elements that are better developed in the movie. The kids are more annoying here. Ian Malcolm is way more insufferable and prattles on about chaos theory for nearly half of the book. The pacing feels way more drawn out, with tangents that tend to lead nowhere. The final section, where several of the characters decide to go and count raptor eggs, knowing that rescue is moments away, just seems out of place. Had the movie not existed, I'd probably rate this higher, but I just didn't really love Jurassic Park. I gave it a 3. The next book I read was The Fellowship of the Ring, and really just the entire Lord of the Rings saga. This is the quintessential fantasy series that all other fantasy novels are judged. And, I'm reading this for the first time in probably a decade or so. Overall, really enjoyed the ride, but Fellowship takes a little while to get started. The level of detail and description, everything from the characters to the setting to what they're wearing to the color of the foliage during every step of the adventure, can be overwhelming. It just goes on at times. And I feel like the first book is maybe the worst paced. I gave that a 4. The Two Towers, I feel like, is a little bit better paced, and you've got the big battle at Helm's Deep. The novel feels a bit snappier overall. It trudges a little bit as you get into Mordor, and it feels a bit arduous. But you really get to feel every step of the journey that Frodo and Sam are taking. I gave it a 5, and that leads us to the Return of the King, and that's the final chapter. Pacing is improved. The lead up to the final battle and the description of that battle is really well done. And that final step towards Mount Doom can drag a bit, but is reduced and paced better than the previous novels, in my opinion. And after the climax, the novel just keeps going and going for several hours, but it does lead to the Scouring of the Shire, which is perhaps my favorite section from the entire series. I just love where they go back home and use all those lessons they learned on their journey to save their homeland. Really good series. I love The Lord of the Rings. If you've not read this, you really should. And next up is Survivor by Chuck Palahniuk, who is the author of Fight Club. And basically, the last survivor of a death cult goes on an adventure starting as a suicide hotline operator that instructs his callers to kill themselves and ends as a television messiah who hijacks a plane. I've read quite a few of this author's books starting with Fight Club, and I can't help but feel they're all basically the same story with the same type of main character, with just a few plot details changed. It doesn't make it bad, but it does feel like it becomes a bit repetitive the more you read from him. The unrelenting nihilism and anti-commercialism is taken to the extreme here and would have made more of an impact on me when I was in high school, but overall I did enjoy the book. And next up is World Departed, which is book 1 of the Cascadia series, which is followed by World Between, World Without, and World Undone. These are all by Sarah Lyons Fleming. She is, in my mind, pretty much the best apocalyptic zombie author out there. I've read every book she's done. It started with Until the End of the World series, and then the City series. These are all in the same world, essentially. They take place in the same locations. There's some crossover between the books. Just really, really well done, well thought out zombie fiction. I'm not going to go into depth on all 4 of these books, but what I would just say is start with the Until the End of the World series. If you read that first book, I bet you'll read every other book she has. Just a fabulous writer. Each of these series, has a different setting. One is more of a travel book. One takes place in New York City. And then this one kind of runs the gamut. This is the longest series. And it's probably the most mature. It has the kind of the oldest cast of characters, the largest cast of characters, and probably covers the most ground of the entire series. This is her most recent book series. So that's all I'm going to say on the Cascadia series. I can recommend all of the books by this author. And next up is the Murderbot Diaries, the first book being All Systems Red. And I've read all 7 of these books back to back: Artificial Condition, Rogue Protocol, Exit Strategy, Network Effect, Fugitive Telemetry, and System Collapse, and can recommend all of these. They're very, very short. They're mostly novellas and one full-length novel. I think most of these you could probably read in like a 2 or 3 hour sit down, and they're very cinematic, very, very movie-like. And the first one has been turned into a television show, and it's on Apple TV. I could definitely recommend checking out the show and reading the books. I really enjoyed each of these. You can see I gave a 4, a 4, a 4, a 4, a 4, a 4, and a 5 for the most recent book in the series. Basically, Murderbot is a humanoid robot who has become sentient and turns off the controls, so humans can't give him orders anymore. And he's basically just trying to get through his day watching soap operas and doing as little actual work as possible. Like, that's where it starts. And as it progresses, he kind of learns, not really empathy, but he learns to appreciate certain humans and to want to help them, and grows as a person. And it deals with some really interesting concepts. It's very funny, very action packed, very satirical. Yeah, I could definitely recommend the Murderbot series. I'm not going to get into individual reviews on all of these. They're short enough that it would probably take me longer to describe them than you could just read them. So, definitely, if you're looking for a new sci fi series, this is a fun short read. Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. is one of the greatest stories ever written. Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time, and he revisits random points throughout his life in a fictional tale that is also a semi autobiographical retelling of Kurt Vonnegut's own time as a prisoner of war during World War II. And the story is short, and it's fast paced, and it's witty, and it's intelligent. It chronicles Billy's time in the war, his attempts at civilian life, his capture by space aliens, and his equal part scathing critique on humanity and hope for a better future. I love Kurt Vonnegut Jr. This and The Sirens of Titan are up there in my top five novels ever written. Really recommend this. 5 stars. You should read this book. Next up is The Institute by Stephen King, which oddly is the only Stephen King on the list this year. I usually read more of his books, but it's a pretty good story. It just doesn't quite reach the top tier of his pantheon. It's a bit derivative of many young adult novels and even some of his own stories, as there's an almost identical plot point in one of the Dark Tower novels, that of children being kidnapped by an unknown group that makes use of their burgeoning psychic powers. It drags a bit in the middle, but has a pretty satisfying ending that makes the whole journey worthwhile. And there's also a television show that has just been made out of this if you're interested. Gave it 4 stars. Next up, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, the author of The Martian, soon to be a major motion picture. This is a story about a school teacher who wakes up with amnesia on a spaceship with a couple of corpses in an unfamiliar solar system, has to piece together both his past and also how to save the world. I really enjoyed this novel. It's funny and heartwarming, and it made me laugh constantly. It's like E.T. meets The Martian with a bit more sarcasm. Gave this 5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. Famous Men Who Never Lived by Cade Chess. So, 150,000 refugees from an alternate Earth arrive in our world after escaping a nuclear holocaust on an Earth that diverged more than 100 years earlier. It's a story that deals more with the trauma of losing everything, or an immigrant story, rather than a story concerned with the science behind the fiction. This story feels like a cross between the biting satire of Kurt Vonnegut and the feeling of the world not quite being right, like Philip K. Dick likes to write. Overall, I like the premise, and the prose is quite beautiful at times, but the plot really doesn't come together. There's two main point of view characters, Hel and Vikram, and a sort of couple from this other Earth dealing with past traumas. Half a dozen chapters devoted to interviews with other refugees, and a story within a story where the main character explains a famous apocalyptic story from their own reality. And there's just too much going on, too many side stories, not enough time devoted to the primary plot, and it just meanders and doesn't really have a satisfying conclusion. I gave this 3 stars. It's got an interesting premise, but it just doesn't all come together. And speaking of Philip K. Dick, I read The Man in the High Castle. I had watched the television show and quite liked it until the ending. It kind of had a terrible ending. So I was curious how the book held up. And I've read a number of Philip K. Dick novels, and I find that I always love the ideas, but I find the execution somewhat lacking at times. The idea here is intriguing. What if the Axis had won the war and split up the rest of the world, just like the Allies did in reality? How would the world be structured decades later, and how would the Cold War between the Nazis and the Japanese Empire play out? The book provides a number of tantalizing ideas, but it just doesn't really go anywhere. There's a bunch of different perspectives with some interesting but flawed characters, but overall, the story kind of just meanders and just ends. There's no real resolution, much like the show, I guess. They go in very different directions, but overall, I thought interesting premise that just really didn't have a satisfying conclusion, and I gave it 3 stars. Okay, so the next dozen or so books are from Robert A. Heinlein, who is an author I read a whole lot of growing up. And I found that a bunch of his novels were available for free on the Audible Plus catalog. And I basically just went through every single book that was on the catalog. So most of these are probably still available if you're an Audible Plus member. We're going to start off with Farnham's Freehold. And it's a 1960 story about a nuclear war that sends a family trying to survive in a fallout shelter, hurtling into an unrecognizable future. Part Cold War bunker survival, part Robinson Crusoe, and part Stranger in a Strange Land, with the family coming to terms landing in a future that they don't understand. This is kind of an interesting one. Basically, it's kind of a reverse racism thing. The story here, it tries to be progressive, and I'm sure it was back in the 60s. The family that lands in the future find a civilization run by the African descendants who have subjugated all of the lighter skinned people, basically all the white people, everyone that's not African American uh, is slaves, kind of a reverse racism thing. It's got some interesting thoughts. There's some kind of uh, racism in it. It's kind of, you can't dance around it. This was, from 60 years ago or so, so it's a little bit more understanding. Um, Overall, I liked parts of the story and has an interesting ending, but it's kind of hard to get past some of the. Uh, you're gonna find this in a lot of the Heinlein reviews. Some of his stuff has not aged as well as others. So, 3 stars here. If you're looking for a Robert Heinlein book, might start elsewhere. And next up is To Sail Beyond the Sunset, another Heinlein novel. This was the last book published before his death and is the culmination of a number of different storylines converging from different series. And he tried to basically tie up a bunch of plot lines. But the book is mostly concerned with describing every sexual encounter that the main character has ever experienced. Maureen Johnson, who is the mother of Lazarus Long, the oldest man in the universe, sits in a jail and described her life from girlhood in the 19th century until her first death in the 1980s, and later her times in the future serving in the Time Corps. And there are things I like in this book. It's less preachy than many of Heinlein novels tend to be. It's got an interesting look at a couple of different alternate histories, but it's way too preoccupied describing all of the lurid details. I don't mind the numerous lengthy sexual encounters described, but the amount of incest, pedophilia, and rape is a bit extreme, and these elements are not just plot points, but at times it feels like the author's just advocating for some of these controversial lifestyles. I feel like later in his career, you find a lot more difficult topics to overlook, more problematic elements. In these last few books, I think kind of went down the drain a bit. So it's an interesting story, but there's just so much here that you got to overlook if you want to read these today. And that leads us to Orphans of the Sky, originally written as a pair of short stories all the way back in 1941 and then combined into a single novel. It feels way ahead of its time for the original publication date. One of the earliest stories to use the concept of a generational ship and the idea of a trip taking so long between the stars that those carried on the ship might forget their own origins. It's the story of descendants living on a generational ship that have forgotten what Earth is or that they're even on a ship, and they consider the ship their entire universe. They've created a complex religion to explain things away. I really enjoyed this one. It's a short and breezy read and holds up pretty well. And it's missing a lot of the more problematic elements of his later stories. Not to say it's perfect. I think in the entire story, there there might be one named female character, and I don't think they even have any dialogue. So it's definitely not like a progressive story or anything, but it's a pretty good sci-fi story that felt really ahead of its time, and I gave it a 4. Next up, A Door into Summer, another Heinlein classic from his golden era. Dan Davis invents a new robotic maid and is then betrayed by his fiancée and business partner, placed in a long sleep, and he wakes up 30 years in the distant future of the year 2000. Robots, suspended animation, and time travel all come into play in this novel, but it uses them to tell a decent story of betrayal and revenge. It's a short and fast read that has a nice sarcastic wit that Heinlein is known for without all the preachiness and with way fewer problems than his later novels tend to have. Gave this one another 4 stars. And that leads us to Time for the Stars, another Heinlein classic. Identical twins, Tom and Pat, are recruited to use their telepathic abilities to act as radios between interstellar ships and Earth. The only problem is one gets to travel the stars and the other has to remain back on Earth. And due to the relativistic speeds involved, the one left behind will age many times faster than the other. The novel deals with the isolation of space travel, being separated from your family and friends, and the idea that they're all getting old and dying while you remain young. And I found this was a really fun read, even though it's one of Heinlein's juvenile novels targeted at younger audiences. It holds up quite well, and it never really talks down to the reader like I would expect. And keep in mind, this book is 70 years old, has some outdated ideas, but overall, it's a really fun space romp with the added telepathic twist. I gave this one 4 stars. Next up, I read Rocket Ship Galileo, another Heinlein juvenile novel. This was the first of his juvenile novels, and I think it's probably the weakest. 3 young friends, with the help of an uncle, build a rocket ship, fly to the moon, and fight Nazis. What's not to like in that? It's a great premise, but somehow it feels really boring. I know it's meant for younger audiences, but everything just goes right the entire time. There's no real threat, there's no real risk, no tension. I'll say that when you consider this was written more than 20 years before the real moon landing, it's amazing how much of the science feels authentic and real. It's not a terrible book, but I just felt it was kind of a bit weaker for Heinlein. It's short, but still feels slow. The risks are basically non existent. And while there's some fun to be had overall, uh, this probably isn't the place to start for Heinlein. And next up is Sixth Column, another Heinlein classic novel originally published in 1941. And there's definitely a few dated concepts here. Essentially, the United States has been attacked and conquered by an unnamed Asiatic empire, and 6 men in a secret bunker have to stop the invading force. They use subterfuge and religion and a lot of racism. It's kind of an interesting one, as the racism isn't all directed at the Asian invaders, but also the Asian invaders give it back to all the white people. So, kind of equal opportunity here. Overall, I didn't really love this one. They exploit religion, which is only, piece of the Western culture the invaders have allowed to survive in the story. And the success of this small group of Russian revolutionaries seems to be due to the incompetence of the invaders rather than really any effort on their part. It's an okay novel. It just doesn't quite hold up to some of my favorites from Heinlein. I give it a 3 star. And next up was Double Star, another Heinlein classic. This is one that I had never actually read before. A lot of these I'd read multiple times previously. Um, but I missed this one. This was a Hugo Award winning from Heinlein, which is about an out of work actor who's hired to impersonate a politician that's been kidnapped and is critical to the peace talks between Mars and Earth. It has wit and the edge he is known for without some of the odd eccentricities of his later novels. And I feel like this is kind of the golden era for Heinlein. It has a number of really memorable characters and a fun plot that moves at a brisk pace. It introduces some really interesting alien races and deals with xenophobia and racism without really feeling too preachy. There's character growth and a well plotted story and a proper ending, something that many Heinlein novels just lack. But this one really all came together and is one of my favorite Heinlein stories, just behind The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Gave this one a 4 star. Next up, For Us the Living, a comedy of customs. This was written in 1938. So technically, I believe that's his first novel, but it wasn't published until after his death in 2003. And this is a story of a man who has an accident in 1938 and wakes up in the future of 2083. And the majority of the story is just dialogue between a couple of characters teaching The time travel are about the changes to society and the world. There's very little action. The story is very thinly plotted. It's rather just an excuse to describe the author's perfect utopia and challenge the belief and morals of the reader. And I can see why this went unpublished. It can be a bit of a bore, but it's also because of the subject matter. The future of 2083 has seen societal changes that have been hard to stomach for many readers in 1938. It deals with sex, marriage, nudity taboos, women working and voting, universal income, welfare, and many other interesting but complicated subjects. In some ways, it feels prophetic and timely now that we're closer to this future timeline than when it was written, but it still comes off as preachy and long winded, and it would have worked better as a short story with more plotting and less dialogue as a full blown novel. It still might be worth reading as a Heinlein fan, but this is definitely more of a time capsule to that earlier period, and I would avoid this one unless you're seeking out to read all of his novels. Max is a farm boy with dreams of being an astrogator in Starman Jones, which is another Heinlein juvenile novel from 70 years ago. But I really like this one. It was targeted at a younger audience, so the language and content is pretty clean, but it still manages to tell a good sci-fi space story while avoiding a lot of the more problematic issues of the later Heinlein novels. Sure, some of the science is dated. They navigate the stars using charts and slide rules. And there's not a computer to be seen, but it's a fun space romp. There's some interesting ideas here, like the majority of professionals being controlled by guilds, many of which you must be born into. The talking alien pet spider puppy that plays a big part in the story is cute, and the light romance is fun without taking itself too seriously. Overall, one of my favorite juvenile novels. Definitely worth a read. Gave this one 4 stars. The Rolling Stones by Robert A. Heinlein, another Heinlein juvenile. The Stone family buys and fixes up a spaceship and has an adventure across the solar system in another juvenile novel from Heinlein. It's a family drama in space, but it's written in 1952, so a lot of the dialogue feels very Leave It to Beaver style. It gets a bit tiring at times. The father likes to argue with everyone in the family, comes off a bit pompous and preachy. Sounds like a typical Heinlein self-insert that he loves to employ. The mother is a doctor, which for 1952 seems pretty progressive, but she also is relegated to doing all of the laundry and the cooking on the ship. And the twin boys, Castor and Pollux, are entrepreneurs, always getting into schemes and frustrating their father. The star of the book, though, is Hazel, the tough as nails grandmother who has a small part in a few other Heinlein novels. Overall, I liked the story that was told, but the dialogue had me rolling my eyes and skimming to the next scene. And it visits some interesting locations, but overall, kind of just a little bit boring. Not at the worst juvenile, but not the best. I gave it 3 stars. And the last Heinlein novel I read, Variable Star, was actually written by Spider Robinson, based off an 8-page outline that Heinlein had left behind. So this is the final story, technically, that was released by Heinlein, though it was actually written by Spider Robinson. And this is what happens when you take that long lost 8-page outline and you hand it to a modern sci fi author. It's an odd mix of old fashioned sci fi plotting with more contemporary writing styles and modern pop references. The story involves Joel Johnston, an orphan who falls in love with another poor orphan, except it turns out she's secretly the daughter of the most important person in the galaxy. Joel is then fast tracked to be the next heir of the family, gets cold feet, and runs away on a colony ship on a 20-year voyage. Overall, I really enjoyed this one. It's an odd combination of old-fashioned storytelling with modern references. That's not without a few oddities. The story appears to take place in the alternate history of many of Heinlein novels, but it also mentions more recent things like the September 11th attack and The Simpsons and other contemporary pop culture references. And the story also falls into a few more of Heinlein's divisive tropes, like the main character meeting a very young girl who, through time dilation shenanigans, ends up a young adult woman while the main character has barely aged and they fall in love. The initial age difference comes off as pretty gross, but it's essentially the same setup from Time for the Stars and The Door into Summer. In fact, the story, he has a lot of connective tissue with those previous stories. And overall, I did like this one and introduced me to Spider Robinson, who I had not previously encountered. And he has a pretty unique voice. At times, the story kind of slows to a crawl, but there are moments where the action feels really breakneck with big twists toward the end. And overall, I like this one. I give it 4 stars. Next up is Destination Void by Frank Herbert. This is actually part of the Pandora sequence, which is a series of 4 novels. I've read all of the sequels, but I had not previously read Destination Void, which sets up that series. And this is the story of the starship Earthling, crewed by disposable clones and controlled by 3 human brains in jars that have gone crazy and doomed the crew unless they can create an artificial consciousness to take over. And this book, I kind of didn't love. It feels pretty boring. It has a lot of kind of Herbert's classic plot within plot structures. Everyone's hiding something or manipulating someone. There's a lot of philosophical discussion concerning what consciousness is and how to create it. It's kind of interesting in that sense, but then they spend most of the book kind of just Star Trek techno babbling for hour upon hour, and I started to tune it out. There's just so much description of creating this artificial intelligence and the components they're using. And this book was written, 6 decades ago, and most of it is just meaningless at this point, other than the kind of philosophical discussion, which isn't really that big of a plot point. So I gave it a 3 stars, probably my least favorite Frank Herbert book I've read. Next up is Wanderers, which is the first book in a 2-book series. The plot here: in the middle of the night, a young woman wanders out of her house and starts sleepwalking across the country. Soon she is accompanied by dozens and then hundreds more, while friends and family follow behind them, acting as shepherds watching over the flock of sleepwalkers. And this is just a really great concept for a story. It's really just the beginning of a very lengthy novel. And it's very influenced by Stephen King and The Stand in particular, but has enough unique elements to stand on its own. And in the tradition of King's novels, it feels way longer than it needs to be. I think that this could use some editing. There's a lot of superfluous characters and descriptions that really don't add much to the plot. It's very slow at times, but when it does pick up, especially in the back half, I really enjoyed it. Overall, I liked the story it told, and it had a good conclusion, and I ended up giving this one 4 stars. And after that, I read Wayward, which is the second book in this series, the final book in this series. And this is a follow-up to Wanderers. It picks up 5 years later after the apocalyptic ending of the previous novel. The sleepwalkers have finally awakened and are committed to rebuilding civilization, but the remaining shepherds who protected them during the long journey are noticing something seems off. The sleepwalkers share a connection and meet up and chant and all around give off kind of culty vibes. And soon the shepherds and the awakened have multiple crises to deal with from within their own community and new enemies from outside. And this is another lengthy Stephen King influenced novel. Again, very, very lengthy. Probably too long. I think you could cut a third of this book and it would probably improve it. Not to say I didn't like it. I still enjoyed this quite a bit, but I felt like it was way longer than it needed to be to tell this story. I give it 4 stars, but you do need to put up with some pacing problems here. And at long last, the final book I read this year was Hyperion from Dan Simmons. And this is the third time I've read this book. This is part of a longer series known as the Hyperion Cantos, which is Hyperion, the Fall of Hyperion, Endymion, and the Rise of Endymion. And the whole series is good, but the first book in particular is amazing. This is maybe my favorite sci-fi novel of all time. And on the eve of an invasion by the Ousters, a supposed group of space barbarians, 7 pilgrims travel to the planet Hyperion to reach the time tombs and petition the Shrike, a godlike entity who impales people on a giant metal tree to grant them a wish. And that probably sounds just insane if you don't know about this novel, but that really just sets the stage for a story that I just absolutely love. It's a fantastic science fiction novel, and those characters they're on this lengthy journey to the time tombs, these pilgrims, and they individually tell their story, detailing how they're connected to Hyperion, and it feels like a sci-fi version of the Canterbury Tales, and has an almost anthology feel to it, where you get 7 really detailed and imaginative sci-fi short stories that include a sci-fi body horror tale, a noir cyberpunk detective story, a futuristic war story, a tale of love lost to time dilation, a poet's journey across 1,000 years, and a father's attempt to save his daughter. Each story could be a novel in its own right, but it's the combination of all these tales on top of the framing device and the amazing world building that make it just incredible. The pilgrims don't even reach the destination by the end of the first book, and it's left for the sequel, The Fall of Hyperion, which is nearly as good as the first. But it really doesn't matter because it's the journey in this case that is infinitely better than the destination. I could really recommend this. This is a 5-star book. It's just fabulous. This entire series is worth reading, but in particular, I think this first book just nails it and is such a good story. So that's it. That's the 52 books I read this year. I still have 51 days left, apparently, when I'm making this video. And I actually started reading The Fall of Hyperion, and will probably finish that series. That'll probably take me to the end of the year. Those are pretty lengthy novels. And then we'll maybe read 52 books next year. And if you like this, drop me a comment. Maybe give me some recommendations for what I should read next year. If you want me to do another review series like this, let me know. I've always been a big reader. I've kind of kept it separate from my gaming and my YouTube stuff, but I just thought it'd be nice to share something else I'm passionate about. So if you like any of these books, if you got any comments on them, any thoughts on my ranking or anything, drop me a comment. If you like what I'm doing, subscribe. Thank you again for watching, everybody. Have a good night.